So another interesting and classic case of damp in a Victorian bay. It's been damp proofed, which is making it worse. There is condensation, the calcium sulfate salts, there's mold, there's damp proofing treatment, as you can see, penetrating damp and heat loss, all in an area of London which can't possibly have any rising damp because all the groundwater is pumped out. And there's no case of flooding in the area, which could cause penetrating damp from the base of the wall. So I'll be looking at all the different causes and the solutions and focusing on data loggers at the end of the survey and telling you how to use them and the how to identify damp through using them. Do go to the end of the survey if you want to speed forward. It takes about half an hour. You've got calcium sulfate salts, these white fluffy salts here.
Yes.
That's calcium sulfate, which comes from the old name for calcium sulfate is gypsum. It's also the name for plaster. It comes from the plaster itself. It's superficial. It can just be wiped away.
Okay.
Or rubbed away with sandpaper. And yeah, it's essentially condensation, for want of a better word. It's internal vapour. I'll explain the issue with these rooms. Well, firstly, I have to say that this is the worst type of drying system. It's the best way of drying clothes.
Yes.
It's the worst way of making a damp wall because it just speeds up the process of moving water from clothes to the coldest wall. And the reason this is the coldest wall is because it's the least well insulated.
Right. Okay.
It's also about the only part of the building not covered by something else. So I'm going to give you 3, possibly 4 things to do, and then we'll see how it improves the data on the data loggers.
Okay.
But we'll look at the data loggers now. So the data logger is down here. I might get you to turn it the other way around actually, just because I want to get the vapour from inside this time.
Okay.
But I'm getting the vapour from the wall. You can also. So you got a lot of heat loss here. You've got the subfloor ventilation, the air bricks, which is a good thing to have.
Yeah.
But you get a heat loss. You've got the bay, so there's a lot more surface area on the outside, and the way it's constructed, the way the bricks are constructed is. There's not as much natural insulation from them, so you're getting lots of heat loss there. I don't see anything particularly wrong with the render here. There's a gap there that needs to be filled.
This is in progress, so we're getting new windows.
Okay.
The whole house, and this will all be filled and sealed again. This is the script.
But I don't think that's the root cause. Otherwise, you get what's called penetrating damp.
Right.
But you will see that around the property, now sort of to the front, it's had damp proofing treatment, and that exacerbates any problems that you might have with internal damp, which is what you're getting, and what majority of these issues are. You've got a bit of moisture down there. Maybe a bit of an overflowing gutter. It looks like a new gutter.
Yes, so we had the gutters done about 6 months ago.
Okay.
These are all new, and there was no gutter on. It's probably relevant for this. There was no gutter around
Above there.
So this is a new gutter.
Okay, so but I don't think it's penetrating through unless you put some stain block on.
No.
I think it's just, you'll see the last video that I've done where they have some penetrating damp, and it's dry now, but it still looks brown, so unless you cover it, it will always have that brown stain. There's a bit of exposed brick, I think, or something.
And it's also, it's not up here either, it's only down there, the mold, the damp.
Yeah, okay, I'll explain why condensation tends to form at the base of the wall and move up, and which is why people think it's rising down, but it's not. You could call it dropping down, but it doesn't have the same marketing ring to it. Descending down. It doesn't sound quite as good, and the scan wouldn't work particularly well for that. But no, it's because so the base of the wall tends to be the coldest anyway, and I'll show you in a thermal imaging camera. The water will fall through gravity, so it will find its lowest point.
Okay.
A damp brick is a poor insulator and then exacerbates the problem, so it just becomes self-fulfilling and it builds up from the bottom upwards, a bit like sand in a sand timer builds up from the
Yeah. Drops down. Okay.
so yeah.
Okay.
But have you had a quote for rising damp treatment or something?
We've had some. Yeah. So before I found you, we had a previous property where we had to have damp proofing done as part of the mortgage deal.
Yeah.
We used a company, and we were quite impressed with their work, and we thought they did fine. So I got them around out of interest to see, but I haven't had the quote. It only came earlier this week, so it'd be interesting to see.
It doesn't affect what I
He
recommend.
thought it was the fact we'd only just had the guttering put in, and he thought it was to do with rain.
You would have a brown stain. Actually, there's a marginal. It's difficult to tell sometimes. There's a marginally brown stain, so it's possible that there's a little bit of penetrating damp. But this started showing years and years ago, and actually it started showing 4 years ago during COVID, and with the COVID we had a much higher incidence of condensation and mould because people were spending much more time at home. And you were cooking during the day, people working from home, school, and so on and so forth. So, and then with the energy crisis, people changed their heating patterns, and so that exacerbated it as well. And once the wall starts getting damp, it's just going to carry on getting damp until you do what I'm going to recommend, which is drop the internal vapor levels as measured by dew point to below the outside temperature at all times. And then it will just resolve all your problems. And they'll disappear, and you won't have to have any damp. You get brown staining when water is moving through the building material. So with condensation, it's forming on the surface and then being absorbed deep into the building material, but it's not moving through the building material. Whereas a brown stain is where water has moved and it's picking up the pigmentation from bricks and or timber, and so it's a sign of penetrating damp. So you have got some penetrating damp, and it's probably a combination of the gutter and the windowsill, which obviously I'm only seeing it in its state when you've removed the paint, but you probably had cracks in it.
Yeah, that's why we removed the paint, because we thought that maybe that's the problem. So we took it off.
Well, it would exacerbate it, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's the root cause. And so condensation is one of those things that, in essence, these Victorian properties were built when you had fires, so there was always constant airflow. People washed weekly, once a week, in the same tub, starting with a dad, and then and you had washing was probably once a week, and it was probably pretty much put outside. But modern day laundries, it's constant flow of wet clothes, and also cooking styles are different nowadays. Pastas and so on tend to produce lots of vapor. So I'm going to give you lots of tips and tricks to solve it, and it will all solve it. I mean, I would recommend that you also seal up the windowsill, in addition to it, and I would recommend that you put on a stain block, because those brown stains will show forevermore. But you just need to sandpaper it down, put a bit of stain block, and paint it. I mean, ideally you let it. No, you don't need to remove the plaster. It's fine. I mean, if you find that it's quite there are a couple of things you might want to do. You might want to put some insulation on it, which would be good anyway. And then the second thing is, if you find it is puckered, which it will be to some extent, because these salts do cause some blistering. It doesn't feel too bad compared to down here. It's a bit puckered, but you may want to get somebody to put in a finishing coat of plaster. But that's like half an hour's job. Looking at damp, I can more or less tell what the cause is before going much further. But looking at it visually, where you can see you're getting the cold at around the cat flap. You see you're getting increased dampness there, and then around there, the bay. They're just natural areas of risk. A lot of people have the radiators into the bay.
Yeah.
The downside of that is you get a lot of heat loss to the outside, so it's energy inefficient. The upside is that you're less likely to get condensation.
Well, in our living room, we've got the radiator in the bay.
And if you're getting a lot of heat, and I can almost feel the humidity coming out, the vapor coming out of that.
Yeah.
And then you've got cold around here. Do you see how, because the thickness of the brick is small there, it's really poorly insulated in the corner, and that's and there as well, and behind the cupboard. And I mean, this is a visual way of understanding why these are the areas that are prone. So let's have a look at the front room. So the one of the interesting things, or not, depending on your view, about the radiator, it's not on. When a radiator is not in use, particularly it's marginally warm. Maybe it's from before. As red is warmer than green, and blue's obviously the coldest. Is that because the water is going into the subfloor, which is cold. When it's not in use, you get heat loss from the radiator, so you get increased risk of condensation. But those will be more in during the period when the heater's not being used much. Autumn and springtime times, so you get increased risk of condensation and mould during those times. I encourage you guys to get one of these. It's called a damp or Dr. meter, known as a damp meter, but I also think of it as being a dry meter, and it will tell you whether the wall is drying out, because you'll see that so we put it onto the second thing, which is masonry, and so here you can use lots of different sort of numbers, but it's quite useful to use the number where the sound starts and just measure that, and then just see how it decreases over time, because it's going to evaporate from the top out, and the dampness, because of gravity, dampness will be drawn down just in the same way as dampness appears to start from the base.
Right, so start measuring it from the top of the dampness.
Yeah, you can use lots. Yeah, exactly, because you're going to see the greatest effect at the top. It will dry from the top, more or less. I mean, it will dry from the surface, but the gravity will pull it down, so it'll be most obvious at the top. And this is showing 100%, but don't think it's 100% water, because the wall will collapse. It's just a number. It doesn't mean anything.
And what's a good number for it to be?
Well, every wall is going to be different, but if you take a dry section of wall, like here, it's a different type. If you take a dry section of right here, well, it's telling me 29, but I would generally be looking for 60, 65. I mean, you're always going to get a bit of moisture in the wall, but
just a little bit.
This is a general rule. You want to keep as much away from the wall as possible, because what you're wanting to do is you're trying to encourage airflow so that you're getting the heat. But really important, more than anything else, you want to drop the vapor level as measured in degrees centigrade as a dew point. You want to drop it below the outside temperature. We'll have a look at the data loggers now. This is in a calibration unit at the moment, which is this, salt and water. But we're just giving it a bit of time to see whether it reaches equilibrium. We've changed these amounts with the calibration, so you can just press on that and press the calibration, and we reduce that by 2.5, but we'll give it a little bit more time to see, because I put some more salt and water in. So we were talking about how the temperature of the bay wall was 9 degrees centigrade compared to the living room, which was what,
20-ish.
20-ish. So that 11 degrees centigrade is a massive difference. And roughly speaking, every 1 degree centigrade drop in temperature increases relative humidity by 5%. So that's an extra 55%. So if in the living room you have 45% relative humidity, you would have roughly 100% relative humidity, and condensation would be on the bay. So that's the importance of relative humidity. Is a measure of air's capacity to hold moisture. The warmer it is, the more moisture you can hold. Conversely, the colder it is, the less you can hold, until you reach what's called the dew point, which is when condensation takes place. In the summertime, it can be nice and warm, and all the rivers and seas and ponds are evaporating out water, and you build up of cloud, and then at night, when it gets cold, the dew forms on the ground outside. That's because it's dropped below the dew point. Dew point is also a measure of the amount of vapour in air. So if we look at your data loggers, it's in a canister, so you don't worry too much about it at the moment, but it's showing a dew point of 12.55. If that air hits the cold wall, it will condense, and you always want to keep the dew point below the outside temperature. So if the outside temperature is 9 degrees centigrade, you want to keep the dew point at 9 or below that by increasing ventilation or dehumidification. If you had a perfectly ventilated house where all the internal air was constantly replaced by the external air, you would have a dew point inside that was identical to the outside dew points. And because if the dew point goes above the temperature, it starts raining. So you can never have an external dew point that's above the outside temperature. Now that would be a very expensive way of ventilating a property, but so long as you always have it below the outside temperature, then you don't run a risk. And in every property, even ones where there's good insulation, you run a risk of parts of the property dropping down below the outside dew point, outside temperature. The cold water pipe, any like the cat flap around that, any metal that comes like cabling, gas pipe, all of that. The subfloor void, anywhere near the subfloor void, because that's you're getting cold air through the subfloor void. The pipe for the radiator that goes into the sub, all of that. So anyway, just a simple rule, and it's called Dew's law. Always keep the internal dew point below the outside temperature. When it goes below 0, it's hard to do it, and for short periods of time it doesn't matter too much, but it's long periods of time. And for mould, it's actually 3 degrees centigrade above the dew point is when you get the mould risk. It's called the mould point, and it happens when surface relative humidity goes above 85%. But for mould, it's when it's long periods of high surface relative humidity, and it's normally made worse by poor air circulation, corners, and obviously cold zones as well. But it's the poor air circulation. So remove objects away from damp walls, basically cold walls. Okay, so I'll give it another minute or so, and I think that's fine. And then I'll get you to send it to https:/damp.ai/detect. I'll put it on the screen. But then it's AI system for analysing data. It's created by AI. It uses AI. It's in beta stage, so there's lots of updating to do, but it will improve over time. What would happen if you damp-proof this? So I go to a majority of properties I go to have already had damp-proofing treatment. So you have already yourselves, and if it worked, I wouldn't have any work. If damp-proofing treatment actually solved the problem, then I wouldn't have a business. Well, I would, but it wouldn't be in damp-proofing. I mean, it wouldn't be in surveying. So you do is you remove this plaster, you replace it with impermeable. So, well, you inject the base of the wall with silicone. I'm not a big fan of it because I don't think it looks great. Doesn't look too bad here, but I've got some at my house and it just looks ugly. And in time, I mean, it will certainly devalues my property. Looking at it, it just looks weird. Anyway, so setting that aside, the worst thing is the slurry. So you're replacing what would be a normal. This has obviously been replastered. I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't damp-proofing treatment anyway, because so the clue is you get this bit of a ridge here where the damp-proofing treatment. But there are lots of different types of slurry. But if this is removed and replaced with essentially impermeable tanking material, it stops the water coming through, but it also stops it being absorbed into the wall, and it stops what's called the wall from breathability. So it increases the risk of condensation and mold because the wall can't absorb vapor in the way it was before. And you often get a line around here of salts. So even if this looks great,
it's coming up.
It gets trapped in behind the slurry, and I'll show some examples after this. But I mean, so the leading, I might as well say, Kenwood. There's a property I went to about 7 years ago, and they'd had damp-proofing treatment when they bought, and it didn't work, so they got Kenwood round, and Kenwood said, "Oh, it's not part of the guarantee," and did it and charged them another. I think they said £5,000 to do some more. And then a few years later, that didn't work. And then they were going to charge them £16,000 to extend it, and obviously not under guarantee. And I went in there and I found that the only thing that was wrong was the internal bathroom vent was blocked and not working, and that was their problem. And that was causing all the dampness. And they had to, and there was also rot, by the way, in that property. So there's some, it wasn't dry rot, it was wet rot. They got a builder to remove the wall, and they put in dry lining, which is basically plasterboard up against the wall. It was just an easier and quicker way of doing it. But it's been dry ever since. Never had any problems. So some properties you don't notice it, but you're only storing up a problem. And anyway, it's not good for walls, and it's not solving the root cause of the problem.
So how long I don't know what the measures are you're going to suggest, but how long are we thinking before this will be repairable?
Okay, so yesterday I was telling somebody that it takes between 6 and 9 months to dry out, and I had a lot of very strong Italian, and it does take time.
Because people want a quick fix.
But they want a quick fix. Yeah. But if you rub this down with sandpaper and paint it over, it will look aesthetically pleasing. Yeah. But you may have to just give it a bit more time to dry out. But I would say using a damp meter, at least you know that you're going in the right direction. Yeah. And by the way, the slurry itself is going to show up as a high damp meter reading. So it might, depending on the slurry that was put in, it may give a false impression. But so what I would suggest is sandpaper it down, and then paint it, and just be prepared to repaint it in 6 to 9 months' time. Be nice to have a good summer.
Yes.
But also obviously, and a fan speeds up the process as well.
Yeah.
Airflow.
Just by the.
Yeah, because it's disrupting the humidity on the surface. So a bit like a wet t-shirt. If you're running with a wet t-shirt, you feel colder than
Yeah.
if you're standing still.
Yeah.
So yeah, with the cap flap, you're going to get increased condensation around that because you get heat loss from that. Not much you can do about it, but it's just recognition. Sockets the same as well. You'll find there's a bit of rust in there, I think. You'll find some sockets blow on cold walls. So looking at the floor, so this looks like an overlay on top of probably the original timber floor, or maybe a chipboard.
Yes, I think it's a chipboard.
But anyway, underneath this, you've got the subfloor airbrick, so you get a heat loss from there. So it's going to be at risk. And I would say there's a little bit of staining here, there. That's called blue stain in service. Not much you can do about it. Just think of it as a feature. But it will be because it has become damp and quite possible. I mean, it can be anything from overfilling plants to but I wouldn't worry too much about it.
But that's not sort of rotting or anything. We don't need to take this.
Well, it is technically a rot, but it's a white rot and very slow, and it's not causing any structural issues.
No.
The timber floor, you've got subfloor ventilation, so it's unlikely you've got an issue with the timber floor. Okay. I mean, the thing here is that you're on a hill. Yeah. So if you had rising damp, you wouldn't have it in a property on a hill. But in London, there's no rising damp because the groundwater's pumped out. So therefore, there should be no rising damp proofing companies.
I mean, to be fair to the people that came round earlier, he didn't think it was rising damp. He thought it was from above. Yeah.
Well,
he didn't say anything about condensation.
I'm not saying that it couldn't. So I think there is an element from the above, but I don't think that's your primary issue. Here as well, if you've got it in one place. Yeah. And this is condensation. We'll have a look on the outside here. Can I just get it's on the outside? Obviously, you're going to get a certain amount of heat loss from that. No, it looks. Quick way to see whether the extractor fan is working well. It's like that. It should be able to hold up a piece of paper by itself, and I wouldn't. Well, you can turn it up, but still not doing it. I mean, you would expect it to do it all by itself. I wouldn't be. No, well, I'm just going to. Knowing what I know about builders, it's probably not even going up here, going into the extractor fan isn't working, and probably because the top of the chimney is capped. We don't know, but you can either uncap the chimney, which obviously has benefits, or be a bit more careful about cooking with tops on pots and pans and turning the heat down. So if you're cooking pasta, you can reduce the amount of vapour produced by about 80% by cooking on with tops and pots and pans. And anyway, I would do this. Run a dehumidifier 24/7. A lot of people don't use extractor fans because they're quite noisy and you can't chat to each other. And even though there's a bit of a rumble from a dehumidifier, you soon get used to it. And personally, that's what I would do.
Where would you place that?
I would place it either where the dampness is worse. I think I'd probably put it there initially, but in the corner here. I would get a 20-litre dehumidifier and look at the sound level as well as the capacity. And also, if you ever go away, put a dehumidifier to drip into the sink with a drain on, and just sit it up here and dripping into the sink, and set it to 70% relative humidity. So here we got some mould, and we got the penetrating damp, the brown staining. Yeah. I mean, I would move things away, including the plant. You got to remember that every litre of water you put to the plant comes back out as a litre of vapour.
Oh, God.
Well, it's just inevitable. That's thanks for you.
So we are having some.
So in conclusion, and before looking at the data loggers, we've got water coming from the outside, but I think the guttering has been improved. So that should be residual and dry out, and you'll want stain blocks to get rid of the brown staining. I would go for an aqueous, so Zinza 123 in the first instance. Then we have some penetrating damp into the bay, but the main issue in the bay is condensation from the excess vapor from cooking and from drying clothes internally, made worse by the heat loss. You can see that around the sides, there are areas where water can get in. Also, the cracking on the sill is going to make it worse. The other thing is the mold. Mold only grows where relative humidity goes above 85%. I think you're getting it in the corner because of the water penetrating through from the gutter, made worse by internal condensation or excess vapor. Have a look at the data loggers website. It's called damp.ai/detect, and you can drop your data logger data into the file. And if we compare the kitchen, because that's where the damp wall was of principal concern, to the living room, but I mean, in this case, the vapor is actually coming from the kitchen as well. And I think the temperature at the time of the survey was 9.2. And if we put it at 10 o'clock on the 17th, try and avoid the time when I was doing the calibration, you'll see that there are large periods of time when you're hitting 100% relative humidity. So this is the surface relative humidity. This is the temperature of the surface. It's taking the temperature of the data loggers and applying the difference between the temperature at the time of the survey to the data logger temperature. So in a sense, it's illustrative, but it's still pretty accurate. Now, this is the dew point, and the dew point is a measure of the amount of vapor in air as well as the temperature where condensation takes place. And you want to drop that below the external temperature by increasing ventilation and dehumidification. And you'll see that when you've got high surface relative humidity, it's because, well, firstly, the blue line is above the red line. It's not going to go much above the red line because it will condense, and therefore you won't see high humidity. But you can get condensation on the surface of the wall, but not on the data logger. So, you know, it can go above that because it's on the actual data logger that this dew point is being measured. But setting that aside, you'll notice that this this lighter blue line is the external dew point, and you'll notice when it's during periods of rain, the external dew point will reach the external temperature, and that's rain is essentially condensation. So you get poor ventilation when you've got high external relative humidity. You need to ventilate more when it's raining because every time you blow air out, it's being replaced by humid air from the outside. So you need to have a higher through flow. Now, this here is interesting. It's what's called the dew point differential, and it's this light grey line here at the base of the wall. And when it's below zero, it's because the vapor source, so in this case, the living room, is less than the kitchen, which is not what I would have expected. And I wonder whether it's telling me actually that vapor is coming from the rest of the property and condensing in the kitchen. So the kitchen is acting as a dehumidifier. That external wall is acting as a dehumidifier. I suspect that's part of the problem. So that means increasing ventilation from the bathroom as well as increasing ventilation in the kitchen and using a dehumidifier. So use this. You can zoom in and just inspect one day, get a better idea of what's happening. You can switch between rooms and compare it the other way around. obviously, in this case, you'll need to put in whatever the temperature of the living room was at the time, and I don't have, well, I do have that, but I don't have that to hand. But the surface relative humidity is less. So interesting. And you can do analysis on it, and it will tells you the amount of time that you're complying with Jew's law, which is very little of the time. So yeah, follow this. It's got UK, sorry, it's London temperatures and dew point that I put in daily, but you can put your own data from your own data loggers into this file if you like. Okay, have a look at the recommendations lower down. Thank you very much.